Today, I have the honor of reading for you an original piece I wrote concerning life inside and outside prison. We in our law and literature class are constantly encouraged to express ourselves in creative ways by our beloved Professor Dr. Prasananchu. After reading so much of prison literature and researching on prison literature, I was inspired to write this. I sit alone in an empty cell, and the prison walls stare at me, reminding me of my crimes, and no amount of remorse seems to break me free. Inside this cell, surrounded by walls of stone and bars of steel, I create another cell inside my head where fettered lie my dreams. Once inside, for the outside, a prisoner is all I'll ever be. So whether inside or outside, in my cell or in my head, a prisoner is all I'll ever be. The poem's titled Prisoner, written by me, Pulkit Goyal. In this episode, we explore the rich prison vocabulary that has developed in prisons and prison literature to better appreciate the various facets through which prison literature and conditions inside prison can be understood. For prison vocabulary, we do not exclusively look at pieces written in prison, but also theoretical works written about prison and the words used there to describe prisons and how prisons are talked about in everyday life. And moreover, we also look at specific cants, argos, jargon that prisoners themselves use in their daily communication.
Thank you, Pulkit, for that wonderful introduction and poem. Now, the first word that we look at is the panopticon. This is a theoretical architectural figure given to us by Bentham. Foucault describes it as, and I quote here, at the periphery, an annular building, at the center, a tower. The star is pierced with wide windows that open onto the inner side of the ring. The peripheric building is divided into cells, each of which extends the whole width of the building. They have two windows, one on the inside, corresponding to the windows of the tower, the other on the outside, allowing the light to cross the cell from one end to the other. All that is needed then is to place a supervisor in a central tower and to shut up in each cell a madman, a patient, a condemned man, a worker, a schoolboy. By the effect of backlighting, one can observe from the tower, standing out precisely against the light, the small captive shadows in the cells of the periphery. They are like so many cages, so many small theaters in which each actor is alone, perfectly individualized and constantly visible. End of quote. So, this architectural framework influenced many prison designs, such as the Presidio Modelo in Cuba or the Lira Stand prison in Amsterdam. The main purpose behind the panopticon is twofold. Firstly, it reduces the collective into a number of individuals who can then be individually surveilled on. And then, secondly, it makes invisible the person doing the surveilling. So, the person being watched is never sure as to whether someone is watching or not. And thus, they always have to be on their best behavior out of fear of being caught. Now, this structure of the panopticon can be discontinuous in usage, but always continuous in effect. So, this instills in an inmate a state of conscious and permanent visibility. So, this creates and sustains the power relation independent of who is watching or whether someone is watching or not. So, writing upon the fact of being constantly watched in prison, Oscar Wilde said, he sat with those who watched his anguish night and day, who watched him when he rose to weep and when he crouched to pray, who watched him lest himself should rob that scaffold of its prey. Nowadays, I'd like to add that the same function is achieved by the use of CCTV cameras to survey upon prisoners. Through this, we see how the prison itself has become a key actor in the life of a prisoner, since power is de individualized and resides within a system rather than an individual guard or a warden.
Another interesting concept is the concept of being institutionalized. We see this concept of institutionalization occurring in the movie Shawshank Redemption, which is based on a novella by Stephen King. in the movie, Red and his friends arrive at an old timers in prison called Brooks, and he's holding a knife-like object against the throat of another one of their friends. Brooks had just gotten his parole approved, which meant that he would actually be leaving prison pretty soon. But he was afraid of getting out, and he was moved to hurt his friend by his desire to stay in prison. At first glance, this looks kind of paradoxical and even illogical. But then you consider the fact that Brooks had been in prison for 50 years, and then it starts making sense. It is the prison in which he grew up, where he spent a majority of his life, and in short, it's everything he knows. And so it's natural that he would feel intimidated by the thought of leaving it. Further, the effects of incarceration go on long after one is out of prison. Red comments that he probably could not get a library card if he tried. And Red is played by Morgan Freeman here. And this kind of explains why Brooks is acting the way he is. The life outside of prison, he knows, is going to be extremely difficult and extremely different from what he has already known all his life. Red describes institutionalized as walls are funny. First you hate him, then you get used to them. Enough time passes, and then you depend on them. Later on, after Brooks is released, he's not able to adjust to life on the outside, and he ends up committing suicide by virtue of being institutionalized. We see this being played out in the real world as well. Suicide rates among ex-prisoners, even in developed and liberal countries such as Sweden, is higher than that of the general population. Quoting from a 2015 study regarding suicide rates among ex-convicts in Sweden, the high overall suicide rate supported the idea that the transition to life outside of prison is a period with substantially increased risk for premature death. Also helps to explain the high rate of recidivism in countries like the US, where the after effects of prison are long-lasting. According to a 2011 report, the average recidivism rate in the US was nearly 43%. Now, beyond specific words like the panopticon and institutionalized, we have also tried to explore the development of prison slang and lingo among the prisoners themselves and the function it serves to help prisoners connect with each other while simultaneously maintaining some kind of privacy from imposing authority figures around them. Ananya, if you could lead us into that.
Thanks, Nadia. So, linguists are no strangers to prison language, or lingo as they term it. An American convict named Randy Keir spent 9 years in prison, and he decided to use his time there to compile a dictionary, which he called street slang. Now, initially, he thought he'd get 1,000 different unique terms that are part of prison lingo, but he ended up collecting over 10,000 terms. And now that's a rich resource for linguists who are studying prison lingo. So, according to him, prison is a good place for such attempts, that is, such research attempts, because as the convicts have nothing else but time, being witty and slick with their speech makes them stand out as an individual. As part of a project called Prison Lingo, the language of prison community, which focused on the language used in the Winchester prison in the UK, Professor Christopher Mulvey spoke to ex-prisoners and current prisoners. He states that prison lingo is primarily a spoken language because although it can be written down, it's not intended for writing. Prison lingo overlaps with the home dialects of prisoners, so sometimes it's difficult and confusing to say whether a word or phrase should be included in prison lingo specifically, or it's just something that comes from their original dialects. Now, Coleman, a linguist at the University of Leicester, has provided some useful terms to help us discuss special forms of the English language. She talks about slang, jargon, and cant. Slang she defines as the ephemeral terms used by any in-group in order to distinguish them from other groups. Jargon she defines as a professional language which allows for precise discussion of topics related to the given vocation. And cant is basically secret language, or language which is used to obfuscate meaning completely from those who aren't accepted by the in-group. And this is usually used for some hidden intent. Now, she also identifies that prison lingo has elements of all these three different types of language. So, cant or secret language is perhaps the most, the oldest form of prison lingo. So, the Oxford English Dictionary calls cant the secret language, which is used by gypsies, thieves, professional beggars, and so on. And thieves' cant was popular on the stage even in Shakespeare's day. Jargon, on the other hand, is where the language of the law and the language of prisoners overlap, and it includes formal terms like wing and block. Slang is the most recent among the three, And it has a strange quality in that it changes at a much greater rate than the language as a whole. And the reason for this is that it has to be unintelligible to outsiders. That is, it shouldn't be understood by prison guards and other people in the who are officials in the prison context. Besides, it also displays great creativity, and it uses elements of irony, rhyme, pun, and image. For example, the word screw has been used to refer to police officers in the UK since Victorian times. And this is because of a punishment wherein inmates had to keep on rotating a particular handle, which did nothing except keep count. It did nothing productive thousands of times, and this was a form of punishment. And a prison officer could increase the count, increase the number of times the prisoner had to do this by way of turning a screw, and therefore he was called a screw. Nowadays, prisoners in the UK, instead of just using the old term screw, they use the word kanga. Now, kanga is derived from kangaroo because it rhymes with screw. Another interesting example is using vanilla to refer to a judge because it rhymes with vanilla fudge. So this is how words have been altered to prevent access to outgroup members. So there was also another interesting incident in the UK as recent as 2009, where prisoners actually started learning 16th century thieves' cant in order to smuggle contraband into the Buckley Hall prison in Rockdale in the UK again. And they started using Victorian era words like cob, fine, and wops, all related to drugs. So by way of doing this, and how the prison guards got onto it was by way of looking at the letters and listening to calls repeatedly where these unique words were being used. So this was another interesting context of using slang in order to hide their true intent.
The problem with collecting prison lingo is firstly the source. Like most online glossaries or even videos you'd watch are compiled by prison guards for themselves and other authority figures, and therefore are not the most authentic source, or maybe very outdated sources. As Ananya talked, that slangs actually develop quite fast. So at any given moment, it is very difficult to be sure that a certain word is in use or not. Secondly, when it's a matter of research, a lot of research papers have also been written documenting different words and slangs used in prison, is that prisoners tend to lie to researchers since they feel that they're being pried on. Because, of course, why would a prisoner tell a researcher what their word for contraband is out of fear that this information might be leaked, and then they'd have to come up with new terms altogether to define contraband? So, therefore, prison lingo is always treated with cynicism and suspicion. However, the prisoners themselves don't take a negative view of their language. According to researchers Tupper and Watley, the reason why prisoners use prison lingo is a form of emotional release. There's only so many ways one can express themselves in prison. And playing with language gives them a creative outlet to express themselves and express violence without themselves being violent, and as well as for the purposes of teasing and joking. Furthermore, the need to learn the lingo in order to not stick out like a sore thumb and picked on by a veteran is another reason that new inmates start using these terms. So a reason that this thing doesn't die out eventually over time. Now, the importance of this varies depending on how violent and unwelcoming the prison really is. So you might be at a prison which is an old prison, and there are a lot of old prisoners, and they've developed a rich lingo which they use, and not using it might make you seem like an outsider and not be accepted by a group, and as a result you'd be picked on. So in such a condition, you'd like to learn the lingo very soon, compared to a prison that's not as harsh, relatively new prisoners, and they themselves haven't developed a full set of lingo yet, and in these situations can be less violent as a result. Apart from prisoners themselves, prison lingo can be an important tool for the families of prisoners back home, for rehabilitation workers, and for linguists, sociologists, and psychologists to study the conditions present inside prison. For example, when a prisoner is left out of prison and they go back to their family, they might still be attached to the prison lingo and use it every day or the other. And it'd be helpful if the families can communicate and there's not a breakdown of communication. And even for sociologists and psychologists, as this helps understand the specific conditions inside prison, by seeing which words are associated with prison guards. For example, Ananya gave us that very interesting example of a screw. Uh, so some examples of these prison words might serve the purpose of illustrating what exactly these prison words do. So an interesting word is backdoor parole. Now, to someone who is not introduced to prison lingo or is not adept with prison lingo, to them it might seem like just a way to get out of prison on parole by underhanded methods such as corruption, bribing, because the association of backdoor and parole. However, in the US context, where there is less chances of paying your way out, it means something much more severe. It means to die in prison. What this term tells us is that prisoners, especially those serving life sentences without parole, come to see the prison as their entire life. This is possibly since most of them do not have contact with the outside world, or that there is no one who cares about them on the outside. They're often abandoned by their families, by their spouses, ostracized by their communities, forgotten by their children. The opportunities and memories of the outside world are so bleak that the prison is all they have left. Such is the concept of institutionalization that Nadia briefly talked about. Similarly, another interesting term is a four-piece suit, to refer to handcuffs, leg iron, and chain waist that they are made to wear, since the opportunity of wearing civilian clothes, much less a suit, is so remote and it is almost impossible. So this shows that joke element that's present inside prison lingo and within which forms an essential part of prison lingo, as it allows prisoners to still be creative, expressive, expressing violence such as being all bound up in chains in a funny and more acceptable way.
Yeah, and thank you, Pulkit. The idea of the entire prison system as the prisoner's whole world is also reflected in prison literature. So this reminds me of the book Mathilukal by Vaiko Muhammad Bashir, who was a prolific writer in Malayalam, who was imprisoned for taking part in the salt satyagraha. So in Bashir's story, his protagonist, who's a prisoner, falls in love with a woman in the women's prison. And then he's heartbroken when he's released, because being released means separation from the woman he loves, and he claims that the outside world is a jail. So this is a commentary made by Bashir on the loveless, lonely lives led by several prisoners outside of prison. Then we've also talked about Papua New Guinea's Last Place, a book which is set in a post-colonial prison. The title of this book in itself is inspired by a common practice among prisoners to refer to the central Bomana prison as the last place. So one of the interviewed prisoners justified this name by explaining, here, and I quote, everything is left behind. There is no beer, no tobacco, no women. You cannot see your forest, your rivers, mountains, and rocks. You cannot see your children. In this kind of place, you are abandoned. So, although Bomana is only a 15-minute bus ride from Port Moresby, the national capital and largest urban sector of Papua New Guinea, the prisoners feel isolated, as if lost in a deep forest. They shared a sense of omission and exile like life, which was taking place elsewhere. And so their prison experience was thus shaped by what was missing. Places draw significance through the history of life, activity that marks them. The houses people build, the gardens they tend to, the baths that they use, the everyday act of feeding and sharing. And yet, Bumana is a place where there is no memory to draw from, no evidence of past inscriptive activity of friends or family. And so, Bumana came to be known as Papua New Guinea's last place because it's hardly a place at all, certainly not in the true sense of the word.
Prisons also often develop their own unique vocabularies. This is all the more prevalent in India, where each region has its own language, dialect, or special terminologies. So, one such word is zamindar, a Hindi word derived from Persian roots meaning landlord. Most of us consider it very common. However, in the prison context, it means something different. Specifically, in a jail in Bokaro, it has come to refer to the prison superintendent. In previous episodes, we referred to how the superintendent had immense powers when it came to matters inside the prison, including the simple act of letter writing. Furthermore, there is abuse and overreach of power that is symptomatic in most Indian prisons. What this means then is that the prisoner, who, as we looked at from Project 39A data, is often from a marginalized and vulnerable background. This prisoner thus sees this abusive superintendent inside the prison the same way he sees an abusive zamindar outside. And now there's another aspect to this. One of the key reasons the landlord is able to exercise his power is because he knows that the farmer is unlikely to be able to flee to villages where landlords would treat them better. And so this gives him a free pass to abuse them. And the farmer laborer is thus bonded to the village and therefore the owner of that land, or the zamindar. Similarly, in the prison, the prisoner is unable to escape the four walls of the prisoner, and thus the same zamindar farmer relationship is created. In an article from 2017, Tihar Jail Superintendent Anju Mangla states that it is time for this vocabulary to change. She even winces at the use of the word jailer, which is much more benign than zamindar, saying that it is too harsh and cultivates a negative mindset towards prison guards and the justice system in general, and that only superintendent is sufficient.
Several prisons in India have what is called an anda cell. So we look at this term anda now, which means egg in Hindi. So the anda barracks are a cluster of windowless cells nestling against a high oval perimeter wall, which is a maximum security zone within the confines of the jail. Now, what we are going to refer to in this episode is taken from Arun Ferreira's The Colors of the Cage, and he experienced this personally. So he says that when he was at the Nagpur Central Jail, to get to most cells from the entrance of the anda, you have to pass through 5 heavy iron gates, winding your way through a maze of corridors and pathways. There are several distinct compounds within the anda, each with a few cells, and each cell carefully isolated from the others. Little light filters into the cell. You can't see anything outside, like greenery or the sky or even other people. And there is a watchtower in the center of the anda. So this is very similar to the concept of panopticon that Pulkit spoke about. So due to this watchtower, and from the there's a watchtower, and from the top, the yard actually resembles an enormous airtight concrete egg. But however, as Arun Ferreira says, there's a vital difference. The anda is impossible to break out of. Rather, it's designed to make inmates crack. And the anda is where the most unruly prisoners are usually confined as a form of punishment.
At this point, it might also be useful to talk about the use of euphemisms, especially when talking about prisons. Before which, let's look at how euphemism and euphemistic writing in general is used in today's political speech. As George Orwell identifies, political speech and writing are largely the defense of the indefensible. Things like the continuance of British rule in India. This political language has to consist largely of euphemism, question begging, and sheer cloudy vagueness. Defenseless villages are bombarded from the air, the inhabitants driven out of the countryside, the cattle machine gunned, the huts set on fire with incendiary bullets. And this exercise is called pacification as a euphemism. When there is a gap between one's real and one's declared aims, one turns, as it were, instinctively to long words and exhausted idioms to starve the sentence of any imagery and to make it more acceptable to the reader as a form of euphemism. Same kind of language is used when talking about prisons. There's a growing tendency to refer to prisons as correctional facilities, just softening the blow. Locking someone in a small room for weeks, for days, weeks, or months is referred to as solitary confinement, something which to the ear is much more pleasant. Transporting someone for days or weeks in shackles, sometimes even to wrong destinations just to teach them a lesson, is named something as benign as diesel therapy, as if my car was being serviced. The use of such language removes from the mind of the reader any imagery of the actual act and therefore makes these things more acceptable and the reader less concerned with what is being said or written about them. It is in a way, the lifeblood is sucked out of the language. It blurs the outlines and covers up meaning. So language here is used as a way to obfuscate, as a way to make things vaguer than to communicate clearly. Because if these things were to be clearly communicated, they would be, as Orwell says, indefensible, or at least not to the taste of people's morality, and therefore these systems would need to be looked at or maybe perhaps reformed. In direct contrast to this kind of language that is used by people on the outside or by politicians to refer to prisoners, is a language used by prisoners themselves. This language lacks euphemism, nothing to soften the blow. Commentators have said that there is a lack of political correctness to the language. They believe that prisoners often believe that people have grown too sensitive over the years. Prisoners still want structural change. They aren't saying that new facilities or reforms shouldn't be carried out or society shouldn't be made more inclusive. But they recognize that a certain strength of numbness is required to make it in prison. And therefore, they identify the society itself as weakening, as becoming too sensitive.
Yes, Pulkit. I'm reminded by what you said of Arun Ferreira's book, The Colors of the Cage, in which he notes that while he was imprisoned at the Nagpur jail, he was flogged with belts, kicked, and slapped on the very first night. The police also threatened to kill him by way of an encounter. And so he writes, within a few hours, I was woken up for another round of questioning. The officers appeared polite at first, but quickly resorted to blows. To make me more amenable to their demands, they stretched out my body completely, using an updated version of the medieval torture technique of drawing. My arms were tied to a window grill high above the ground, while two policemen stood on my outstretched thighs to keep me pinned to the floor. This was calculated to cause maximum pain without leaving visible injuries. Despite these precautions, my ears started to bleed and my jaws began to swell. In this description, we can see how, although the officers are using euphemisms like encounter and questioning or inquiry, the prisoners themselves do not mince their words while describing their experiences. And so this brings us to the conclusion of our episode. We've covered various prison terms and theoretical concepts, such as the panopticon. We've even looked at the contrast with which euphemistic language is used about prison and the lack of euphemistic language used by prisoners themselves. Now, please tune in for our next bonus episode, which you'll see shortly. Thank you.